The city pulsed outside the high-rise windows, skyscrapers slicing through the morning fog, but inside the boardroom, time seemed frozen. A heavy silence blanketed the room, broken only by the quiet ticking of a $40,000 wall clock that no one ever looked at. The board of executives, predominantly white, mostly male, sat in a row of polished leather chairs around a long mahogany table, flipping through their paper agendas, sipping black coffee from porcelain cups. Then the door opened. He walked in without hesitation, shoulders square, movements fluid, his dark navy suit tailored to perfection, the kind of fabric that whispered money rather than screamed it. His presence was calm, deliberate, but it hit the room like a spark in dry grass. Heads turned. Eyebrows lifted. Someone cleared their throat. A tall man with silver hair and a Harvard ring resting on his index finger narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me," he said flatly, barely concealing his irritation, "this meeting is for board members only. You might be in the wrong room." It wasn't the first time Derek Thomas had heard those words. He'd heard them in hotel lobbies, in luxury car showrooms, even once in the executive lounge of an airline he personally owned equity in. But this time, it came from a man whose salary Derek had personally approved just last quarter. And still, even now, even in this room, it happened. Derek didn't flinch. He didn't stutter. He didn't even blink. He closed the door behind him quietly, the soft click echoing through the room like a gavel. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but steady, low and resonant, the kind that didn't have to rise to command attention. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He walked the length of the table slowly, not in a show of dominance, but with precision, each step erasing the question of whether he belonged. He reached the head of the table and placed his leather briefcase down. A nameplate was already waiting there. Derek J. Thomas, Chief Executive Officer. Silence. Some of the newer board members had never met him in person. The company had gone through a fast and brutal leadership shakeup after the previous CEO was ousted during a financial scandal, and the search committee, pressured by both investors and lawsuits, had been pushed to look beyond the usual mold. Derek, with a long history of turning failing tech divisions into gold, had been hired discreetly. Some hadn't expected him to last a quarter. Others hadn't expected him to show up at all. And now, he stood before them, not as an intern, not as a janitor, not as a guest, but as the man who held the keys to their future bonuses. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he scanned the room, making eye contact with each person individually, his gaze neither aggressive nor timid, but direct. Measured. A reminder that he had read every report, knew every budget line, and had every right to sit exactly where he was standing. "I see we're off to a warm start," he said with a dry smile. A few chuckles, awkward and forced. One man, red-faced and squirming, looked down into his coffee like it could save him. Another, a woman in her early 50s, smiled faintly and gave a subtle nod, the only one who didn't seem surprised. Derek finally took his seat at the head of the table. "Let's begin," he said. And just like that, the meeting was his. But behind his composed exterior, there was a fire building, not of rage, but of resolve. He had worked too hard, lost too much, and risen too far to be reduced to a mistaken identity. This wasn't just about a boardroom. It was about every room that had ever made him feel like a stranger in his own success. And this time, he wasn't going to walk away quietly. He was going to own it. Every table. Every room. Every seat. Starting with this one. As the board meeting lurched forward, Derek could feel the weight of eyes on him, not the kind of gaze reserved for leadership, but the kind you give to an unexpected variable in an otherwise predictable equation. He let it sit. Let the silence draw out after he'd made his opening remarks. Let them squirm a little. After all, discomfort was a language they all understood, and one he had been fluent in since childhood. A man 2 seats down, thin and ruddy-faced, finally broke the tension. "Well," he said with an overdone chuckle, "I suppose we'll just get used to seeing some new energy around here." There it was. Polite sarcasm, dipped in passive dismissal. Derek smiled thinly, leaning forward with his fingers steepled. "New energy is what saved your division from being shuttered last fiscal year, Mr. Grant." His voice was still calm, but each word landed with clinical precision. "I assume you read the Q2 earnings report. Or shall we review it again?" Grant's mouth opened, then closed. The room hushed again. They had hired Derek because they had no choice. The company had suffered 2 brutal years of stock drops, lawsuits, and public relations disasters under their previous CEO. Investors wanted someone who could clean house. And Derek had, faster than anyone expected. But the same board that had signed his contract hadn't anticipated the face that would come with that competence. In their minds, leadership still looked a certain way. Talked a certain way. Moved a certain way. And Derek? He didn't smile too much. He didn't fill silence with meaningless buzzwords. And he sure as hell didn't try to make them feel comfortable with his presence. He didn't need to. When they moved to the financials, Derek didn't bother with PowerPoints. He flipped through pages, cited numbers from memory, and asked questions that made half the table sweat into their collars. Every time someone tried to talk over him, he stopped them, not loudly, but firmly, with a raised eyebrow and a clipped "I wasn't finished." Midway through the meeting, someone brought up a controversial acquisition proposal, an old guard board member who'd expected a rubber stamp. Derek shut it down in 5 minutes. "We're not throwing shareholder trust into a company under federal investigation just because you play golf with the founder." It was bold. Too bold, for some of them. One man actually scoffed under his breath. Derek turned to him. "Something funny?" "No," the man replied, flustered, shifting in his seat. "Good. Because from where I sit, what's funny is how often integrity makes people uncomfortable." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was respect being recalibrated. They were beginning to realize something important: this man didn't need their validation. He had already outperformed every short-term CEO projection in just 2 quarters. The shareholders were thrilled. Media outlets were starting to whisper about a turnaround story of the decade. And here he was, doing the job while simultaneously battling every microaggression they thought they could veil in civility. He wasn't a guest anymore. He was the future of the company. And the sooner they realized that, the easier their jobs would be. But Derek wasn't just interested in doing the job. He was here to change the way they thought the job should look. And they had no idea how far he was willing to go to make that happen. The meeting ended, but no one moved right away. Papers were shuffled, glasses were drained, throats cleared, but every executive seemed reluctant to be the first to leave, unsure of how to retreat without admitting the shift that had just occurred. Derek remained seated at the head of the table, unbothered, flipping slowly through his notes like he had all day. The tension in the room clung to the walls like the scent of expensive cologne and old money. Eventually, one by one, they filed out. Some gave him polite nods, a few avoided eye contact entirely. A couple offered half-hearted compliments: "Great meeting," or "You run a tight ship," the kinds of things said when someone realizes they've underestimated you but still haven't found the humility to apologize for it. He accepted each gesture with a measured nod, never letting them see whether he took it as respect or residue. As the door closed behind the last of them, Derek exhaled quietly and leaned back in his chair. The silence now was different. It was ownership. The view from the boardroom window stretched wide over the city: skyscrapers, bridges, rooftops bathed in afternoon light. It was the kind of view meant to remind you of power, of place. But to Derek, it was also a reminder of cost. He remembered walking into rooms like this 10 years ago, not as a CEO, but as a consultant, or an analyst, or worse, as someone assumed to be catering lunch. He remembered the polished smiles that froze when he introduced himself. He remembered how they called it grit when a white man rose through adversity, but called it attitude when he demanded basic respect. There was a knock. The door opened, and Eva Chen, the company's general counsel, stepped inside. She was one of the few people on the board who hadn't flinched when he walked in that morning. She had been a quiet ally since the beginning, observing more than she spoke. She closed the door behind her. "They thought you were someone's assistant," she said without preamble. "I know," Derek said calmly. "They're not ready." "They don't have to be," he replied. "They just have to follow." She smiled, a little impressed. "That thing with Grant, brutal. He earned it. Twice." Eva walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat. "You're not just here to run this company, are you?" Derek looked up from his notes. "I'm here to change it." "And the culture?" she asked. He closed the folder in front of him. "I want to burn the old one down. Then we'll start over." Eva nodded slowly. "You'll have enemies. I've had them since the day I showed up with a Harvard MBA and they still ask me which department I cleaned." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, looking out at the skyline. "This table," Derek said, tapping his knuckles on the heavy wood, "was custom-made for the first CEO of this company. He had it flown in from Italy. You know what the board used to call it? Eva raised an eyebrow. Legacy furniture. As in, something old, respected, never moved. That's how they see themselves. Like this table, heavy, untouchable, unchanged. She tilted her head. And what do you see? Derek stood, sliding his chair in smoothly. A table's just wood. If it no longer serves the people at it, it becomes dead weight. Eva smiled again, slower this time. You are going to be trouble. I already am. And with that, he walked out, not like a man leaving a meeting, but like a man walking deeper into a building that now belonged to him. He wasn't legacy furniture. He was the architect. And it was time to rebuild. Later that evening, Derek sat alone in the back corner of a quiet restaurant tucked between two tall glass towers in Midtown, one of those upscale places with linen tablecloths, dim lighting, and waiters who spoke in whispers. He didn't come here for the food. He came for the quiet. For the chance to think. For the ritual. Ever since he took the job, he made it a point to sit with his thoughts after major board meetings. It wasn't self-congratulation. It was survival. Reflection, after all, was the only weapon they didn't expect him to use. He stirred his tea slowly, barely noticing the steam rising from the cup. His mind was still replaying the moment they told him you were in the wrong room. It hadn't surprised him, no, he had predicted that moment. What had surprised him was how calm his voice had stayed. How easy it had become to deflect doubt, to carve out authority in places that tried to deny it to him at the door. A low hum of conversation surrounded him. Businessmen at nearby tables murmured over overpriced steaks, deals sealed with bourbon and ego. He caught snippets of talk, hedge funds, mergers, product launches, but one particular voice caught his ear. I'm telling you, the company's falling apart. They hired that new guy, what's his name, Thomas? Yeah. That's who they brought in. Bold move, I guess. Not what I expected for the face of a tech turnaround. The voice belonged to a man 2 tables over, white, mid-50s, red tie loosened at the collar. He was speaking to another man who nodded along, not noticing Derek at all. Guy walks in like he owns the place. But let's be honest, the man continued, chuckling, he doesn't look like any CEO I've worked with. You know what I mean. The other man laughed. Yeah. Not exactly legacy material. Derek said nothing. He didn't flinch. Didn't rise from his seat. He simply took a sip of his tea. It was bitter. But familiar. These men, these types, would never understand the weight of walking into rooms that questioned your presence before you spoke a word. They didn't know what it was like to have to outperform just to be tolerated, to outshine just to be visible. They didn't know what it took to sit at a table built for others, and refuse to let them push your chair away. His phone buzzed. A message from Eva, great job today. PR team already seeing positive shifts in media chatter. Thought you'd want to know. He texted back, thanks. They'll get used to seeing my face. He looked back at the 2 men, still laughing quietly to themselves, basking in their ignorance. They didn't know they were talking about the man sitting just a few feet away. They didn't know that the very building their firm rented space in now bore his name, after a quiet real estate deal made 6 weeks earlier. They didn't know that the company whose leadership they were mocking had just doubled its projected recovery time because of his decisions. They didn't know that the man sipping tea in the shadows had heard it all before, and had turned every word into fuel. He stood, left a generous tip, and walked out without looking back. Let them talk. Let them laugh. Let them doubt. He didn't need to be legacy. He came to rewrite it. The next morning, the office buzzed with subdued tension. Derek arrived early, as always, no fanfare, no entourage. Just a calm stride, a nod to the front desk receptionist, and a silent glide through the gleaming hallways lined with plaques and portraits of past leadership, all white, all stern-jawed, all men. The only color in those frames was the sepia tin of aging film. Derek's office, newly renovated but still carrying the bones of its old occupant, overlooked the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in sharp morning light, exposing every inch of the glass desk where stacks of confidential reports, investor memos, and legal briefings waited. He'd read them all. Twice. A habit he'd never shaken, the burden of knowing he couldn't afford to miss what others were allowed to skim. Today, however, was about paper. Not the kind you file, but the kind you write. He sat at his desk and began composing a memo. Not just any memo, this would set in motion a structural shift in company hiring practices, C-suite evaluations, and board transparency. Not a press-friendly diversity pledge. Not a vague promise of inclusion. This was a blueprint for power redistribution. For systemic untangling. For justice with a paper trail. Each paragraph cut deep into the legacy of exclusion, outdated recruitment pipelines, insular executive promotions, unspoken biases masked as cultural fit. He named them, measured them, dismantled them. And he backed every sentence with data, impossible to refute, undeniable in impact. If someone wanted to challenge him, they'd have to confront the numbers. And the numbers were on his side. By noon, the document had been reviewed by legal, HR, and the internal ethics committee. Some pushed back, gently, cautiously. One email warned, "This is an aggressive repositioning. It may cause unrest at the top." Another cautioned, "Long-time board members may feel alienated. Recommend softening tone." Derek replied only once, "The tone is fine. The culture should adjust to it, not the other way around." He called a meeting with the communications director to prepare an internal rollout. "This isn't just a policy shift," he said. "This is the new DNA. I want it understood company-wide that change isn't a suggestion, it's here. And it looks like me." The comms director, a young white man with nervous energy, nodded slowly. "Understood. Should I prepare a media response?" Derek paused. "No press yet. Let's see who resists it first." Because he knew they would. Change always revealed its enemies by how loudly they squirmed. By the time the memo went live that afternoon, the boardroom was already stirring. 2 directors requested private calls. One tried to schedule an urgent lunch. Another sent a one-line email, "Are we sure this is the direction we want to take?" Derek smiled when he read that one. "Yes," he replied. "We're finally going in the right direction." He closed his laptop, stood slowly, and looked out at the city again, no longer just steel and skyline, but something else entirely. Proof. Of progress. Of presence. Of the fact that for the first time, the paper trail of power would finally lead back to someone who wasn't supposed to be there. And yet, here he was. Still rising. Still writing. Still impossible to ignore. That evening, as the office lights dimmed floor by floor and the building exhaled into silence, a very different kind of meeting took place, unofficial, unrecorded, and entirely off-calendar. 5 board members gathered in a private room at a luxury club downtown, the kind with valet-only parking, gold trim, and cigars waiting in humidors before the guests even asked. They were all white, all older, and all deeply uncomfortable, but not with each other. With him. "He's moving too fast," said Grant, swirling his scotch with a sour look. "The memo? The hiring policy? He's gutting everything we built." Another man leaned forward. "He's changing the board structure. That's not incremental reform, that's a power play. Quiet, but unmistakable." A third adjusted his cufflinks, voice low. "And the investors love him. So do the press. We can't challenge him publicly without looking like the ones who won't evolve." Grant scoffed. "They call it evolving. I call it being replaced in our own house." Silence. No one said what they were all thinking, but it was obvious. "He's not like us." They didn't say it with malice. That would have been too obvious, too clumsy. It was said with fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of being outmaneuvered by someone who was never supposed to rise this high, this fast, without asking for permission. "Then we find a way to limit his scope," murmured the man at the end of the table. "A compliance review. Oversight committee. Something procedural. We make it about governance. Not race. Not power. Just stability." "Stability," Grant repeated, as though tasting the word. "That'll sell." Someone raised their glass. "To protecting the foundation." They clinked crystal. Meanwhile, Derek was still at the office, long after the others had gone. He stood in the dim glow of the hallway outside the boardroom, gazing at the old portraits again. The men in the frames stared out stoically, their legacies lacquered onto the walls. He pulled out his phone. A message from Eva, hearing whispers of movement. "They're trying something." He typed back one word, "expected." Because Derek knew what came next. Change always triggers fear. And fear always triggers plotting. But what they hadn't realized yet, what they had never learned about men like Derek, was that he didn't rise by accident. He had studied rooms like theirs long before he ever entered one. He'd learned the language of the boardroom, the rules of backdoor conversations, the coded phrases masked as corporate strategy. And he had his own plans. Let them gather in secret. Let them whisper behind mahogany doors. Because when Chapter 7 began, it wouldn't be whispered. It would echo. A week passed. Then too. The whispers turned into quiet moves, hushed emails, sudden committee proposals, a performance review policy floated through HR like a test balloon. Derek watched it all unfold with clinical calm. He didn't fight it. Not directly. He knew how power behaved when it felt threatened, reactive, subtle, shrouded in process. But what the board hadn't learned, not yet, was that while they were working in the shadows of the old system, Derek had already stepped beyond it. On a Friday morning, a full board meeting was called, mandatory attendance. The agenda was vague. That was by design. Grant had pushed for it, convinced he had the numbers to quietly censure Derek or at least dilute his authority under a new committee. Derek arrived last. He entered the room in silence, wearing a gray suit tailored like armor, and took his place at the head of the table. No smile. Just a stack of folders, a steel pen, and a presence that demanded the room adjust its temperature to him. Grant cleared his throat. Before we begin, I think it's time I'll begin, Derek said calmly, opening his folder. There was something in his voice that cut through the air, something definitive. The room stilled. I know some of you have concerns, he continued, and I respect that. It's hard, watching change unfold from the center of a table built to keep things static. But while you've been organizing your discomfort, I've been organizing something else. He handed out packets. Inside, a summary of a quietly approved shareholder shift, co-signed by the firm's largest institutional investors. A legal restructuring of executive oversight that no longer required full board sign-off. And most damning of all, a paper trail of backdoor conversations, leaked politely by someone in Grant's own circle who had grown tired of the whisper politics. This is a list, Derek said, of every call, text, and off-record meeting tied to efforts to undermine executive leadership. Yours, Grant. And yours, Michael. And yours, Henry. I'm not here to fire anyone today, though I'd be well within my right. I'm here to make one thing clear. He stood. You no longer get to gatekeep the future. You don't own this room. You don't own this company. And for the first time since this corporation's founding, this board answers to something larger than tradition. He walked to the window, looked out over the city, then turned back. I am not your legacy CEO. I'm the correction. And I didn't come here to be tolerated. I came here to lead. Silence. Not from fear, from impact. A woman at the far end of the table began to clap. Then another. And another. Not everyone joined, but enough. The message had landed. Derek didn't smile. He didn't need to. This wasn't triumph. It was arrival. He gathered his folders, nodded once to the room, and left without another word. Outside, in the hallway, a younger employee, an intern, was waiting by the elevator. Black, maybe 19, nervous in a too large blazer. The intern looked at Derek, eyes wide. Mr. Thomas. That was. I mean. Do you really run the whole board? Derek glanced down, then offered the smallest of smiles. No, he said. I run what comes next. The elevator dinged open. Derek stepped inside, the doors closing behind him. In the old world, the one built without him in mind, stayed behind, one floor below the future.